Sheqweetta Vaughan was just 32 years old when her name became tied to a story that few could have imagined. A mother, a daughter, a woman trying to hold her world together. Her life would unfold in a series of tragedies that exposed not just her personal struggles, but the flaws of an entire system. On a December day in 2020, Sheqweetta was driving along Atlanta's I-285 with her children in the car. Within moments, her life changed forever. The vehicle lost control, slammed into guardrails, and was struck by another car. Her 3-year-old son, Sameze, was not buckled in. He suffered devastating injuries and later died. Sheqweetta herself survived, carrying a head wound and an even deeper wound in her heart, the loss of her little boy. That single moment of chaos would not only haunt her, but would follow her into the halls of the justice system. The public saw a grieving mother, but prosecutors saw something else. They charged her with reckless driving and child cruelty. Facing the weight of the legal system, Sheqweetta accepted a plea deal, 2 years in prison, followed by 6 years of probation. For some, it was a fair consequence. For others, it was another blow to a woman already broken by tragedy. In December 2024, she walked through the gates of Arrendale State Prison in Georgia. It was supposed to be the beginning of her punishment. Instead, it became the beginning of her end. Just 3 weeks into her sentence, she gave birth while incarcerated. A child brought into the world behind cold prison walls, with no family to comfort her, no freedom to embrace the moment. It was a brief flicker of life and hope in the midst of her confinement, but only months later, Sheqweetta would be found lifeless in her segregation cell. On July 9, 2025, guards discovered her body in cell H19. The summer heat had turned the room into an oven. Her skin showed signs of blistering, her body already decomposing. Fellow inmates later said they had heard her calling for help the day before, but no one came. By policy, prisoners in segregation should be checked every 30 minutes. Yet the condition of Sheqweetta's body raised one haunting question. How long had she been left alone? The coroner's report revealed no drugs, no contraband, no signs of violence. Her death was labeled undetermined. But to her family and to many who have heard her story, the truth felt far more chilling. In this episode, we'll unravel the tragic story of Sheqweetta Vaughan, a mother who survived a devastating loss, only to face an even darker fate behind prison walls. If you're not subscribed, you might miss stories like this, cases that expose what could happen to anyone when the system fails. Don't risk being left in the dark. To understand how Sheqweetta Vaughan's life reached such a devastating conclusion, we must begin with the years before her name became a headline. Sheqweetta was 32 years old, a young mother with dreams, responsibilities, and the heavy weight of life's pressures pressing down on her shoulders. Her life was not without struggle, but like many, she carried on, determined to provide for her children and hold her family together. December 2020 marked the day that everything changed. Sheqweetta was driving on Atlanta's busy I-285 with her children. It was a normal day, or so it seemed. But in a matter of seconds, normality was shattered. The vehicle she was driving lost control, skidding violently into guardrails before being struck by another car. The crash was sudden, the sound of metal tearing into metal echoing through the highway. Sheqweetta herself suffered a serious head wound, but her injuries were nothing compared to what happened to her 3-year-old son, Sameze. He had not been buckled into his seat. The impact was unforgiving. He was rushed for medical treatment, but despite all efforts, his small body could not recover. Sameze died from his injuries. The image of a mother surviving while holding the loss of her child is one that struck a painful chord. For Sheqweetta, grief became her constant companion. But grief alone was not all that followed her. Prosecutors charged her with reckless driving and child cruelty, arguing that her actions had directly led to her son's death. The public was divided. Some saw her as a negligent mother whose choices brought about a tragedy that could have been avoided. Others saw her as a mother destroyed by an accident, punished twice, once by fate and once by the justice system. Eventually, Sheqweetta accepted a plea deal. 2 years behind bars, followed by 6 years of probation. To the outside world, this might have seemed like closure. For Sheqweetta, it was only the beginning of her descent into a far darker chapter. In December 2024, she entered Arrendale State Prison in Georgia to begin serving her sentence. It was the state's largest women's prison, a place that already carried a reputation for overcrowding, strict discipline, and stories of neglect. Just 3 weeks into her sentence, Sheqweetta gave birth behind bars. A child born into confinement, a moment that should have been filled with love and family, instead became a stark reminder of her isolation. And then came July 9th, 2025. On that day, guards discovered Sheqweetta in her segregation cell, H19. The sight was horrifying. Her body was already decomposing, her skin blistered from the suffocating heat inside the small room, where temperatures had soared into the 90s. Inmates claimed they had heard her cries for help the day before, but no one answered. By policy, guards were supposed to check on inmates in segregation every 30 minutes. Yet the state in which her body was found made it painfully clear. Something had gone terribly wrong. The coroner's report found no signs of trauma, no evidence of drugs or contraband. Officially, her death was listed as undetermined. But for her family, and for those who learned of her story, the truth pointed elsewhere. Toward neglect, unanswered cries, and a prison system that had failed to protect her. Sheqweetta Vaughan's story is not just about one mother's tragic journey. It is a story about accountability, oversight, and the human cost of a system that looks away when voices beg to be heard. The questions surrounding Sheqweetta Vaughan's death did not fade after the coroner released her report. In fact, they grew louder. How could a woman, locked away in a high-security prison, simply slip away unnoticed until her body had already begun to decompose? By policy, segregation cells were to be checked every 30 minutes. That was not a suggestion. It was a rule designed to prevent exactly this kind of outcome. Yet, the condition of Sheqweetta's body told a chilling story. Hours, perhaps an entire day, without proper supervision. Reports from fellow inmates only deepened the concern. They claimed they had heard Sheqweetta calling out for help the day before she was found. Her voice, echoing from behind the thick steel door, went unanswered. Was it dismissed as noise? Was it deliberately ignored? Or had guards grown so used to the sound of desperation in segregation that they no longer recognized it as urgent? These were the haunting questions her family was left with. When officials announced that her cause of death was undetermined, it did little to ease the suspicions. The coroner found no signs of trauma, no drugs, no contraband, nothing to explain why a healthy 32-year-old woman would collapse and die so suddenly. Her family, and many who followed her case, believed the truth was far more uncomfortable. The heat inside her cell had risen into the 90s, a stifling environment with poor ventilation and little relief. In those conditions, dehydration and heat-related illness can become deadly within hours. Left without medical attention, Sheqweetta may have slowly succumbed to the very environment she was forced to endure. But there was also the question of her health after childbirth. Just 3 weeks into her sentence, Sheqweetta had given birth in prison. The weeks and months following childbirth are critical for a woman's health, both physically and emotionally. Without proper care, complications can arise quickly. Was her death the result of untreated medical issues, or a failure to monitor a vulnerable mother who had recently given birth behind bars? The official record did not provide answers. It only left her loved ones with more doubt. The neglect that seemed to surround her final hours struck at the heart of a larger issue. Arrendale State Prison had long been criticized for its handling of inmates, especially those placed in segregation. Stories of oversight failures, delayed medical care, and preventable deaths were not new. Sheqweetta's case simply brought those issues into sharper focus. For her family, grief was compounded by anger. They had lost Sameze years earlier in a tragic accident. Now they had lost Sheqweetta, under circumstances that could not be explained. To them, the system had failed twice, once in punishing her beyond her grief, and again in failing to keep her alive while in custody. Her story is more than an isolated tragedy. It is a reflection of what happens when policies are written but not followed, when cries for help are ignored, and when accountability fades behind prison walls. What remains is a life cut short, a family left without answers, and a haunting reminder of the dangers hidden in places meant to protect society. The aftermath of Sheqweetta Vaughan's death rippled far beyond the walls of Arrendale State Prison. For her family, the shock was unbearable. They had already endured the unimaginable loss of 3-year-old Sameze, a child whose life ended on the side of a busy Atlanta highway in 2020. Now, less than 5 years later, they were forced to bury Sheqweetta herself, under circumstances shrouded in confusion, anger, and unanswered questions. Her family demanded transparency. They wanted to know why her body had been left long enough to begin decomposing in her cell. They wanted to know why no officer had responded when inmates reported hearing her cries. They wanted to know why a young woman who only months earlier had given birth was locked in segregation without closer monitoring. Yet, what they received instead were carefully worded statements, reports that explained little, and an official cause of death labeled as undetermined. Her story soon began to draw the attention of advocates for prison reform. Organizations that had tracked the conditions inside Georgia's correctional facilities saw in Sheqweetta's case yet another example of a system overwhelmed by neglect. Overcrowding, lack of medical staff, and extreme heat inside facilities had been reported for years. Inmates placed in segregation, isolated from the general population, often bore the heaviest weight of these failures. The descriptions of Sheqweetta's cell were difficult to ignore. Temperatures soaring into the 90s, poor airflow, and hours without intervention created an environment not fit for human survival. For critics, her death was not a mystery. It was the predictable outcome of a system where human needs are ignored until it is too late. Adding to the weight of the tragedy was the timing of her life's events. Sheqweetta had entered prison carrying not only the grief of her son's death, but also the physical burden of pregnancy. Within 3 weeks of her incarceration, she gave birth behind bars. It was a moment that symbolized both resilience and despair. The life of her newborn child began within the cold confines of a prison hospital ward. The mother herself, weakened and vulnerable, returned to confinement with little more than the promise that she would one day rejoin her family. Instead, only months later she was discovered lifeless. The irony was inescapable. A mother who had once lost her son in a car crash, who had faced judgment from the courts, who had been forced to give birth in captivity, was now herself gone, her story ending in a cell marked H19. For those who knew her, Sheqweetta was not simply the subject of a headline or a statistic in a prison report. She was a woman with a family, with children who would now grow up without her, and with a story that reflected the silent failures of the institutions meant to oversee her custody. Her death left more than grief. It left a shadow of suspicion. Was it the heat? Was it neglect? Was it medical complications overlooked until her body could no longer withstand them? Official records did not answer those questions, but the silence surrounding her cries for help spoke volumes. The case of Sheqweetta Vaughan remains a chilling reminder of what can happen when oversight collapses, when duty is neglected, and when human life is treated as expendable behind closed doors. Her family may never have the answers they deserve, but her story stands as a testimony, one that forces us to look closer at the hidden corners of justice, where punishment too often becomes a sentence of death. As news of Sheqweetta Vaughan's death began to spread, the details surrounding her final hours struck a deep chord within the community. It wasn't just the loss of another life behind bars, it was the pattern that her case seemed to confirm. Families of other inmates had raised similar concerns in the past. Stories of women left without medical attention, of cries ignored, of bodies discovered too late. Sheqweetta's death was no longer just a personal tragedy. It became a symbol of systemic failure. Her family was devastated. They remembered her not as the headlines described her, but as the mother who laughed with her children, who celebrated their birthdays, who carried the weight of her struggles quietly. The crash in December 2020 had already scarred them forever. The loss of little Sameze had carved a wound that never healed. Now they were asked to accept that Sheqweetta had died in a cell, under undetermined circumstances, with no accountability from those tasked with her care. For them, the official explanation was not enough. Advocates and community leaders began asking the same questions. How could a 32-year-old woman be found decomposing in her cell when policies clearly demanded welfare checks every 30 minutes? If she had called for help, as inmates insisted, why was she left alone? The descriptions of her cell told a grim story. Temperatures inside the segregation unit had soared into the 90s. Ventilation was poor, and water access was limited. Prolonged exposure to such heat can cause rapid dehydration, organ failure, and death. For those who followed the case, the answer seemed obvious. Neglect had killed her. Yet the official report remained silent on those points. The coroner listed no trauma, no drugs, no contraband. Undetermined. That single word closed the case on paper, but in reality, it left the most important questions unanswered. To her loved ones, it felt like another dismissal, another moment when Sheqweetta's voice, and now her memory, was ignored. Adding to the weight of suspicion was the fact that Sheqweetta had recently given birth behind bars. Just 3 weeks into her incarceration, she had delivered a baby within the prison system. Postpartum women are among the most vulnerable, requiring medical attention, rest, and emotional support. But inside Arrendale State Prison, her vulnerability may have been magnified, her needs left unmet. The combination of heat, isolation, and possible untreated complications created conditions where tragedy was almost inevitable. Her story began to resonate beyond Georgia. Across the country, activists highlighted her death as an example of how prison systems often fail women, especially mothers. Reports of oversight lapses and heat-related deaths in U.S. prisons were not rare. Sheqweetta's name became another on a growing list of those who had died under questionable circumstances, another reminder that behind the statistics were human lives, families, and futures cut short. For her children, the loss was immeasurable. They had already lost their little brother. Now they would grow up without their mother. For her family, there would always be a shadow of what could have been, a life that might have been rebuilt, if only the system had provided care instead of neglect. The haunting truth is that Sheqweetta Vaughan's story may never receive the justice it deserves. Officially, her death is closed, stamped undetermined. But for those who remember her, for those who heard the unanswered cries from her cell, there is nothing uncertain at all. She died in a place meant to confine her, yet it was neglect and silence that truly ended her life. Her case forces a question that cannot be ignored. How many more voices will go unheard before change is demanded? Inside Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women, Sheqweetta Vaughan carried her grief quietly. Fellow inmates recalled her as a woman who rarely spoke of her pain, but whose eyes betrayed a weight far heavier than her years. She had lost a child, the kind of loss that strips away a piece of the soul. And now she was serving a sentence in a system ill-equipped to recognize or treat the layers of trauma she endured. In the weeks leading up to her death, Sheqweetta complained repeatedly of pain, severe chest discomfort, difficulty breathing, and a heaviness she could not shake. Medical staff documented some of her visits, but responses were often delayed and treatment limited. Requests for further evaluation went unanswered. She filed grievances, wrote letters, and pleaded with officers for help. Yet, time after time, her words seemed to vanish into silence. For many incarcerated women, these cries for medical attention are often brushed aside, treated as exaggeration or viewed through the lens of punishment rather than care. In Sheqweetta's case, every missed opportunity to listen became another step toward a tragedy no one would be able to reverse. On September 22, 2022, Sheqweetta Vaughan collapsed in her cell. Inmates screamed for guards, pounding on doors, demanding that someone respond. The moments that followed remain a point of painful debate. Some say medical staff took too long to arrive. Others insist that procedures were followed. What is certain is that by the time Sheqweetta received serious attention, her body had already reached the point of no return. She was pronounced dead at just 32 years old. The official cause: complications from untreated medical issues. But for those who knew her story, The explanation felt insufficient. They saw not only a woman who died, but a mother failed by a system designed to hold her, not heal her. Her family, already reeling from the loss of her child years earlier, now faced the unthinkable. Another loss, this time behind prison walls where answers were scarce and accountability even scarcer. Questions poured in. How many times had she asked for help? How many opportunities were missed? And how many more women inside the same prison faced the same silent neglect? Sheqweetta's death became more than a statistic. It was a painful reminder of how invisible incarcerated women can become once they are placed behind barbed wire. Outside the prison, vigils were held. Advocates raised her name, connecting her case to broader patterns of neglect in correctional facilities across the country. Her story forced the public to confront a question many would rather ignore. When a mother, a daughter, a sister is locked away, does she stop deserving the most basic right to care? Even today, the memory of Sheqweetta Vaughan lingers in the voices of those demanding reform. She is remembered not only as an inmate, but as a woman who suffered, who begged for help, and whose final hours were marked by silence, where there should have been action. Sheqweetta's story is not one of numbers or policies. It is one of humanity, cut short by a failure that should never have happened. After Sheqweetta Vaughan's sudden death, the walls of Fluvanna Correctional Centre seemed to hold a heavy silence. Among inmates, whispers grew louder. They spoke of how she had pleaded for medical attention, of how her complaints had been dismissed, and of how officers treated her as if her pain were nothing more than an inconvenience. Some recalled her banging on the door of her cell, calling out in desperation. Others remembered her leaning against the cold metal, struggling to breathe before collapsing for the final time. In the hours that followed, officials moved quickly. Reports were filed, timelines were constructed, and statements were gathered. The prison administration insisted that all protocols had been followed. But those who lived alongside Sheqweetta every day had a different story, one that pointed not to compliance, but to neglect. They questioned why medical requests had been ignored, why her symptoms had been downplayed, and why urgent care seemed to arrive only when it was already too late. Her family was devastated. They had spoken with Sheqweetta only days before her death. She had shared her struggles, describing the pain that lingered without relief. They encouraged her to keep pushing for treatment, to file grievances, to keep her voice from being silenced. And she had tried. But in a system where prisoners are often reduced to numbers, her cries never carried far enough. When the call finally came that she was gone, her loved ones were left broken, grieving not just the loss of her life, but the way she had been ignored until the end. Advocates outside the prison quickly took notice. The Fluvanna facility had been under scrutiny before. Years earlier, lawsuits had already alleged systemic medical neglect, claiming that inmates with life-threatening conditions were denied adequate care. Courts had ruled that improvements were required, yet Sheqweetta's death suggested those promises had not gone far enough. Her case became another painful example used by activists to highlight ongoing failures within the Virginia Department of Corrections. The community responded with outrage. Candlelight vigils were organized, her name written on signs held high in protest. People demanded answers. They wanted to know why a 32-year-old woman, who had survived the devastating loss of a child, had been left to die from medical issues that could have been addressed. They wanted to know why her repeated warnings had not been enough to save her. And most of all, they wanted accountability for a system that allowed her to slip away unnoticed until it was far too late. As pressure mounted, officials promised reviews. Investigations were launched. Yet for many, these promises felt hollow. Sheqweetta's family had already buried her, her children had already been left motherless, and the weight of her absence could not be measured by paperwork or reports. Her story echoed beyond the prison gates. It was no longer just about one woman's suffering. It became a reflection of a system where silence often meets cries for help, and where the cost of neglect is measured in human lives. For those who continue to fight for reform, Sheqweetta Vaughan's name stands as both a warning and a demand. A warning of what happens when voices are ignored, and a demand that no more lives be lost in the same way. In the days after Sheqweetta Vaughan's death, Grief gave way to questions that no one seemed eager to answer. The official explanation pointed to medical complications, but for her fellow inmates and her family, those words felt like a veil covering something far more painful. They remembered her persistence, her determination to be heard even when the system seemed deaf to her suffering. She had written letters, filed complaints, and told anyone who would listen about the chest pain that kept her awake at night. Yet each time her pleas had been met with indifference. Inside the prison, the women who shared space with Sheqweetta carried their own scars. Many had experienced the same dismissals, the same long waits for care, the same fear of what might happen if their own medical issues were ignored. To them, her death was not an isolated event, but a chilling confirmation of what they already knew. In Fluvanna, pain too often went untreated until it became fatal. They spoke quietly among themselves, each story echoing the next, building a pattern that felt impossible to ignore. Her family refused to let her memory fade into silence. They began reaching out to advocates and community leaders, demanding accountability. For them, this was not just about losing Sheqweetta, but about the way she was lost. She had been a daughter, a sister, a mother, and to see her reduced to another statistic in a prison report was unbearable. They wanted the world to know her name, to understand the circumstances that had stolen her life, and to recognize the failures that had allowed it to happen. Outside the prison walls, organizations already fighting for reform seized on Sheqweetta's case. They pointed to the long history of lawsuits against the Virginia Department of Corrections, highlighting the promises of change that had never fully materialized. Reports of inadequate staffing, delayed treatments, and dangerous neglect had been documented for years. Now, with Sheqweetta's death, those warnings carried a new urgency. Media outlets began to take notice. Stories were published, bringing her face and her name into the public eye. Readers learned about the young mother who had endured the unimaginable loss of a child, only to die in a place where she was supposed to be under state care. The more people learned, the more outrage grew. How could a woman cry out so many times for help and still be left without the treatment that might have saved her life? For the women still inside Fluvanna, the aftermath of her death left a lingering fear. If Sheqweetta's cries could be ignored, what would happen the next time someone else collapsed? Would their voices carry any further than hers? The uncertainty weighed heavily, turning every ache and every symptom into a reminder that the system around them was fragile and often unresponsive. As the months passed, Sheqweetta Vaughan's story became more than just another chapter in the history of prison neglect. It became a rallying cry. Her name was spoken at vigils, written on banners, and carried into courtrooms where advocates demanded change. Though her life had ended, the echoes of her struggle refused to be silenced.